Osborne's featherfall carries the party safely to the frozen ground below as the fortress begins collapsing behind them. The group pauses for a moment to catch their breath. Bon Bon scans the icy landscape. I spotted a group heading toward the castle. Osborne looks into the distance. Must be the druids. Not wanting to reveal themselves, the party quickly decides to hide and watch from cover. As the approaching figures draw closer, they wait to see who arrives. The shattered gates groaned in the bitter wind as the party hurried toward the fortress entrance. Behind them stretched a frozen wasteland. Ahead waited only darkness. There would be no turning back. The group quickly moved into position. Weapons were checked. Spells were prepared. Everyone knew the next few moments could decide whether they lived or died. Savin glanced toward the others. In that test room, there was that corridor that was dark. Ambush? Bon Bon shook his head. Let's not call it an ambush, though. Despite the attempt at humor, the tension remained. Together, the party stepped through the ruined gate and into the ancient fortress. Cold blue flames flickered along the stone walls. The silence was almost unnatural. Only the echo of armored footsteps disturbed the ancient halls. Without hesitation, the party began descending the endless staircases beneath the castle. Each level carried them farther from the surface, farther from daylight, farther from any hope of an easy escape. Murdoch thought and said, "I have a spell that will restore our stamina." The others nodded and made their way. The familiar chamber of trials stood silent beneath layers of frost. Ancient stone walls echoed with the party's footsteps as they cautiously entered once again. Nothing had changed, or so they thought. Waiting in the center of the frozen room sat the enormous walrus they had encountered before. The gentle giant lifted a flipper in greeting as the party approached. For the first time since entering the fortress, there was a friendly face. Savin stepped forward and lowered his voice. "Don't tell the druids we're here, and we'll get you out." The walrus blinked slowly, then let out a patient sigh. "Well, you already agreed. But okay." The party couldn't help but smile. Even in the darkest corners of the Frostmaiden's fortress, there was still room for a little humor. With one last nod, the group prepared to continue deeper into the frozen halls. The hardest trials still lay ahead. The party slipped quietly into the shadows. Just beyond the corner, 6 druids stood gathered around the imprisoned walrus. No one dared make a sound. Savin disappeared into the darkness, carefully peering around the stone wall to study their movements. The druids weren't performing a ritual. They were waiting. Then, without warning, the great doors of the trial chamber began to move. Ancient chains groaned. Massive gears echoed through the fortress. Slowly, the enormous stone doors lifted into the ceiling, revealing a hidden vault beyond. Tower upon tower of shelves stretched into the darkness. Ancient relics, weapons, armor, treasures collected over countless years. This was no ordinary storage room. It was the Frostmaiden's vault. Savin didn't hesitate. He thrust out his hand.
Now.
Blue arcane energy surged from his fingertips and raced toward the towering doorway. The stone floor trembled. Rock burst upward from the ground. Within seconds, a massive pillar of solid stone slammed beneath the descending gate. Crunch! The heavy doors crashed down against the pillar instead of sealing shut. For a few precious moments, the vault remained open. The party had their chance. Now they only had to seize it before the druids realized what had happened. The moment the stone pillar locked the great doors open, the party sprang into action. There would be no second chance. With a thunderous battle cry, Gideon and Bon Bon charged shoulder to shoulder into the startled druids. The defenders barely had time to turn before the 2 paladins were upon them. Gideon drove forward behind his shield like an unstoppable battering ram. The collision sent the nearest druid crashing onto the icy floor. His staff flew from his grasp as he struggled to catch his breath. Before the druid could recover, Bon Bon closed the distance. His flaming greatsword carved a blazing arc through the frozen air. One swift strike ended the druid's part in the battle before he could utter another spell. The remaining druids stared in disbelief. Their formation had been shattered in a matter of seconds. Now, with the vault behind them and nowhere left to retreat, the fight truly began. The surviving druids raised their twisted staffs toward the frozen ceiling. They called upon the Frostmaiden's power. The temperature plunged. Snow and ice swirled through the chamber as ancient magic answered their plea. Moments later, 3 enormous polar bears emerged from the icy storm. With deafening roars, the beasts charged the party. 2 of them crashed straight into Gideon. Massive claws scraped across his shield. Powerful jaws snapped at his armor. Again and again, the bears struck with savage fury. But Gideon stood like an immovable fortress. Every claw glanced away. Every bite failed to find its mark. The 3rd bear lunged at Bonbon with enough force to crush a man where he stood. At the last possible instant, Bonbon twisted into the blow. The bear's claws screeched across his enchanted armor, throwing a shower of sparks before sliding harmlessly away. The summoned beasts had failed to break the party's front line. Now, it was the heroes' turn to strike back. The heroes answered the druids' magic with relentless precision. Savin thrust out his hand. 4 radiant daggers of holy light sprang into existence. They streaked across the chamber like falling stars. One after another, the glowing blades struck a druid square in the chest. The man staggered backward, his staff slipping from his hands. For a brief moment, he fought to remain standing. Then his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the frozen stone floor. Before the remaining druids could recover, Osborne stepped forward. With a sharp gesture, he unleashed a blazing firebolt. The streak of flame tore through the icy air and slammed into another druid. The impact engulfed the spellcaster in fire, forcing him back with a cry of pain. Then came the final blow. Murdoch calmly raised his heavy crossbow. He squeezed the trigger. The holy bolt thundered across the chamber. It struck the burning druid square in the chest, hurling him backward and ending the fight in an instant. In only a few heartbeats, the party had cut the enemy's numbers nearly in half. The remaining druids suddenly realized they were no longer the hunters. The battle turned in the party's favor with astonishing speed. Bonbon holstered his sword for only a moment. From his belt, he drew his holy pistol. The enchanted weapon roared. Its radiant shot struck the wounded druid square in the chest, sending him reeling backward. Only one enemy spellcaster remained. Bonbon wasted no time. In one smooth motion, he drew a gleaming javelin from his back and hurled it across the chamber. The weapon flew with deadly precision. It pierced the final druid before he could utter another spell. The old priest staggered. His staff slipped from his fingers. Then he collapsed to the frozen floor. The moment the last druid fell, the summoned creatures began to dissolve. The massive polar bears burst into swirling frost and drifting snow before fading completely into the icy air. Silence settled over the vault once more. The battle had lasted only moments, but the heroes had claimed a decisive victory. With the fighting finally over, the party secured the lone surviving druid. The antlered priest was bound tightly with rope and seated against a cold stone wall. No one spoke at first. Each member of the party considered what questions needed answering. They had come too far to leave without the truth. Savin finally broke the silence. Murdoch, heal him. We need answers. The armored cleric gave a simple nod. Of course. Murdoch knelt beside the wounded druid and placed a gauntlet hand upon his chest. Warm golden light flowed from his hand. The druid gasped as his wounds began to close. Color slowly returned to his face. His eyes fluttered open. Good as new, Murdoch said with a satisfied nod. Before the druid could gather his thoughts, Savin raised a hand. Green arcane energy coiled around his fingers before taking the form of a venomous viper. The magical serpent struck without warning, sinking its fangs into the druid's neck. Savin leaned closer. Now, no funny business. The terrified druid swallowed hard. He understood exactly who was asking the questions. With the surviving druid secured, the party prepared for the interrogation. If we get a zone of truth, Murdoch said, we can find out if there are traps or anything else waiting for us. Savin nods and says, let me help strengthen the spell. Golden runes spread across the frozen floor, surrounding the bound druid in a circle of divine magic. No falsehood could be spoken within its radiant glow. Or so everyone believed. Savin studied the shimmering circle for a long moment. Then a faint smile crossed his face. He knelt before the bound druid. "If you tell us everything we need to know, we'll let you go." The druid searched Savin's face. The magic remained silent. No resistance. No warning. The spell accepted the words as truth. Osborne blinked. Savin would never leave a loose end. Savin winks too, and motions to play along. "Wait." Bon looked from the glowing circle to Savin. "Did you just—" Even Murdoch stared in disbelief. Savin had somehow spoken a lie. Inside a zone of truth. The magic hadn't stopped him. The party immediately realized what had happened. Somehow, the Bladesinger had discovered a way to deceive the spell itself. The druid, however, believed every word. The druid lowered his head. There was no point resisting. Bathed in the golden light of the zone of truth, he began answering every question honestly. "There are no traps. It is safe to enter the prayer chamber now." The party exchanged relieved glances. It was exactly the answer they had hoped to hear. The druid continued. "That is where the Codacil of light is kept." A smile crept across Bon's face. "Let's go." As the party prepared to leave, Gideon turned toward the bound prisoner. "Don't play games with the prisoner, Savin." Murdoch nodded in agreement. "We'll take him to prison, where others can judge his crimes." Savin simply shrugged. The interrogation was over. Now there was only one objective left. Recover the Codacil of light. The great doors to the prayer chamber slowly opened. Beyond them stretched a wall of swirling frost and magical mist. No one knew what waited on the other side. Osborne stepped forward, tightening his grip on his staff. "I got this." Without another word, the wizard disappeared into the frozen fog. Beyond the curtain of frost stood the object they had crossed the frozen north to find. Resting upon a stone pedestal beneath a beam of pale blue light was the Codacil of light. The ancient tome radiated quiet power. Its pages whispered with old magic. Its presence filled the chamber with an almost overwhelming sense of peace. Osborne stepped forward without hesitation. As his hand touched the sacred book, a voice echoed through the chamber. "Will you court death to receive my blessing?" The wizard didn't even pause to consider the offer. He looked directly at the Codacil. "Take your blessing." Then, with a grin spreading across his face, he added, "And shove it." For a heartbeat, silence filled the chamber. Behind him, the rest of the party exchanged bewildered looks. The Codacil of light rested safely in Osborne's hands. The ancient relic had accepted him. Its power now belonged to the party. Osborne looked back toward the prayer chamber one last time. A mischievous grin spread across his face. "One last thing." He raised his hand. A tiny bead of flame streaked through the open doorway. An instant later, the prayer chamber vanished behind a roaring fireball. The explosion thundered through the fortress, filling the hall with fire and echoing stone. Osborne lowered his hand with a satisfied nod. "That's for trying to test me." The party stared at him in stunned silence. Savin slowly shook his head. "That's an expensive insult." Bon couldn't help but laugh. Even Gideon fought to hide a smile. With the Codacil secured and Osborne's final insult delivered, the party turned their backs on the chamber and made their way to Room of Trials. With the Codacil of light secured, the party made their way back to the trial chamber. The enormous walrus looked up as they entered. Osborne smiled. "All right, big guy? You ready to see those waters again?" The walrus's whiskers twitched. "I've been ready for a very long time." A grin spread across Savin's face. He stepped forward and gently scratched the walrus beneath the chin. "Meet you guys outside?" Savin asked the rest of the part. The walrus gave a slow nod. Blue arcane energy gathered around Savin's hands. Ancient runes spiraled through the air as a shimmering portal opened beside them. The walrus glanced back at the Rue one last time and says, "I'm so glad to leave this place." Savin smiled. "Let's get you home." The two stepped into the glowing portal together. In a flash of brilliant blue light, they vanished. The portal folded shut, leaving the rest of the party standing in the silent chamber. Bon Bon chuckled. I think we just rescued the friendliest prisoner in Icewind Dale. The journey home had finally begun. With Sovereign gone, the rest of the party began the long climb out of Grimskull. Step after step, the endless staircases seemed even longer on the way back. Murdoch let out a weary sigh. I hope I never see these stairs again. Osborne glanced up toward the distant daylight. I wonder if we could have increased the number of people the teleport targeted. Gideon simply sighed. No one had the energy to argue. At last, the four companions emerged from the fortress into the freezing mountain air. Waiting outside was Sovereign. Beside him sat the enormous walrus, happily reunited with the open sky. The great beast raised a flipper and smiled as the party approached. Told you he'd get me out, the walrus said proudly. Sovereign gave a casual wave. See? I said I'd meet you outside. The party couldn't help but laugh. After everything they had endured inside Grimskull, seeing their unlikely friend free at last made the journey worthwhile. The party emerged from Grimskull victorious. Waiting outside the ruined fortress stood Velen Harpel. The old wizard's eyes widened as the group approached. You've done it? You have the Codacil? Osborne stepped forward and carefully placed the ancient tome into her waiting hands. Velen turned the heavy book over, studying its weathered cover before opening its pages. A smile slowly spread across her face. Incredible. She carefully closed the Codacil and held it against her chest. I'll need some time to decipher its secrets. If the legends are true, this may finally lead us to White Yacharwayan. Sovereign rested a hand on the walrus's broad head. I could use a short rest while I get our big friend here, all the way back to the water. The walrus smiled. I've waited long enough. A little farther won't hurt. The party shared a tired laugh. For the first time in what felt like ages, the impossible mission was finally complete. Now a new adventure awaited them. That night, after the long journey from Grimskull, exhaustion finally claimed Sovereign. He drifted into a deep sleep beneath the cold northern sky. Then, a distant voice began to sing. From the first flame, let truth arise. From night's embrace, unveil the skies. By dawn remembered, by stars forgiven. Let shadow yield to light once given. The haunting chant echoed through the darkness. Sovereign's eyes slowly opened. For a moment, he wasn't sure whether he was dreaming or listening to something far older than memory itself. As he looked up, brilliant sunlight pierced the storm clouds overhead. He raised a hand to shield his eyes from the sudden warmth. The endless gray sky that had hung over Icewind Dale for so long was breaking apart. Golden rays spilled across the land. For the first time in what felt like an age, the sun had returned. For the first time in nearly 2 years, the people of Icewind Dale looked up and saw the sun. Its warm light broke through the endless storm clouds, washing the frozen land in brilliant gold. The long night was finally over. Cheers erupted across the mountains. The party stood together outside the walls of Grimskull, basking in the warmth they had fought so hard to restore. Bon Bon laughed. Gideon raised his shield in triumph. Murdoch lifted his crossbow toward the sky. Osborne grinned beneath the morning light. Velen smiled as her owl perched proudly upon her shoulder. Even the great walrus threw both flippers into the air. I knew we'd make it. Sovereign looked around at his companions. Every battle, every trial, every impossible challenge had led to this single moment. Together, they had broken Oryl's endless winter. And, at last, the sun shone upon Icewind Dale once more. With Oryl defeated, the party turned their attention to the long journey home. There was still plenty of treasure to bring back. Gideon carefully secured the enormous egg to his horse's saddle. Murdoch eyed it with approval. We're eating good for a while with that. Gideon tightened the last strap. Before he could answer, the giant egg suddenly rocked from side to side. Everyone froze. Gideon slowly looked over his shoulder. I think it heard you. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then laughter broke out across the group. Bon Bon shook his head with a grin and began fastening the heavy treasure chest onto his own horse. The expedition had begun as a desperate mission to save Icewind Dale.
Now.
They were leaving with ancient relics, hard-earned treasure, and, perhaps, one very unexpected passenger. The journey back to the coast would take hours. Savin looked toward the distant shoreline, then to the great walrus beside him. I don't want to walk that. He turned to the others. Russ and I are going to teleport to the shore near the ship. We won't let the captain leave without you. Savin calls out as he leaves. The walrus gave an eager nod. A shimmering portal blossomed into existence beside them. Savin smiled and waved. We'll see you at the beach. Together, he and Russ stepped through the glowing gateway. An instant later, they were gone. The rest of the party set off across the frozen landscape, beginning the long trek toward the coast. Hours later, they finally reached the shoreline. Waiting beside the ship stood Savin. Russ floated happily in the icy water, waving both flippers as the party approached. The ship's captain stood nearby, exactly where Savin had promised she would be. Told you we'd wait, Russ called with a grin. The long adventure through Grimskull was finally behind them. Now, it was time to sail home. The captain looked over the weary adventurers as they approached the shore. Her eyes widened. You really did it. Bon Bon smiled as he stepped forward to greet her. We'll tell the whole story, and we'll talk about the treasure. But first,
food.
Then some well-earned rest. The captain laughed and clasped his forearm. I think you've earned both. The crew quickly loaded the horses, supplies, and hard-won treasures aboard the waiting ship. Before long, the party climbed into the waiting rowboats and pushed away from the icy shore. Russ lifted a flipper high above the water. Don't be strangers. Come visit sometime. Savin smiled and waved back. We will. The boats drifted across the calm sea toward the ship. Behind them, Grimskull slowly disappeared into the distance. Ahead, the voyage home awaited. Their quest to end the everlasting rime was over. But for this band of heroes, their greatest adventures were only just beginning. The ship caught the wind, and Grimskull slowly disappeared behind them. For the first time in months, the sky was blue, the seas were calm, and the curse of endless winter was finally broken. The crew stood quietly along the stern, watching the island shrink into the distance. Russ bobbed beside the ship, waving one flipper. I'll miss you weird little landwalkers. Savin laughed and waved back. We'll miss you too, Russ. The walrus grinned. Don't take another 1,000 years to visit. Everyone laughed. As silence settled over the deck, Murdoch rested his arms on the railing. I'm still curious. If we failed that trial. The others exchanged thoughtful glances. No one had an answer. Perhaps the Codacil had tested more than courage. Perhaps it had tested compassion. Or perhaps it had simply wanted to see what choices they would make. Whatever the truth, the Codacil had chosen them. And, with it safely aboard, the heroes finally turned their ship toward home.